welcome to our next Horizon Series webinar, Livestock and Society. It's hard to imagine, but it's over 18 months ago that LRIC started this series of webinars looking at the big things affecting the livestock sector, across sectors, whether you're beef, dairy, pork, etc. We've had some very interesting topics, and this is our 12th webinar. And today, I think it's going to be a very big picture look at what's happening in livestock, and certainly the importance of livestock to the economy, environment, and food security. We have an excellent speaker today. I'm sure you will have questions and points you want to make. Please direct those to the Q&A function, and Chloe will be taking care of those after she introduces the speaker, and then Jean will ask the questions in the roundabout. We do have some really exciting topics coming up, dates to be set, but keep an eye on this spot, so to speak, for data, big answer, but what's the problem? Single-use plastic on livestock farms and the impact of livestock on soil health. So with that, thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Chloe.
Thank you, Mike. Today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Vaughn Holder, Research Project Manager in Beef Nutrition at Alltech, as our speaker. Dr. Holder is a ruminant nutritionist and agricultural biotechnology researcher with a keen interest in the role of nutrition regarding disease and health in animals and humans. We were pleased to have Vaughn speak at our annual meeting this year, where his knowledge and interest in this area sparked this conversation on the role of livestock in climate change and food security. Look out for the white paper on this topic, which will come out later this week. We are delighted to have Dr. Vaughn Holder as LRIC's expert on livestock and society.
Thanks very much, Chloe. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that I'm obviously very passionate about. I will make a couple of statements about this. I'm obviously from the industry, and I am certainly biased in that fact. But the data that I present are very, very legitimate data, and all of these papers are available upon request. So if you are interested in any specific item that I present today, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I'm happy to share those publications. So livestock and society, obviously this is pretty important and pretty huge topic to cover in 20 minutes. So I'm going to touch on a few things that I think are pretty important for us to talk about and to know as we go through this process. And it's all about whether livestock has a role in food security in the future, given all the pressures that we have on us right now. And I'm sure the answer, as you can imagine, is probably a resounding yes from me, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I think that that's the case. So to start off with, I'm going to go look a little bit at the current status quo, right? We can't decide how we're going to get somewhere unless we know where we are right now, and that's understanding where we are as far as global food security is at the moment. And there's a nice, interesting paper in Global Food Security last year by Paul Moen, where he actually looked at food sufficiency statistics and decided where we are. So I encourage you to have a look at that paper. But this is essentially the graph that most global leaders would be looking at when they are looking at food sufficiency. And that red line in the middle of that curve is the average daily protein requirement for humans. That's debatable. That could be higher or lower depending on the source you look at. And then you got the two sources of proteins that are making up that daily requirement, right? You've got the orange is animal-based protein and the green is plant-based protein. We rely on a global basis very heavily on plant-based protein, as you can see, and it makes up the bulk of the protein intake in most cases. And we think that in general, we're above that red line. We're actually doing a pretty good job. And we could take some of this excess protein from the right of the curve and pop it into the left of the curve, and we should be okay, right? So in general, it looks like we're doing okay. However, when we look at these types of situations from the human nutrition standpoint, these figures are gross protein, or essentially in animal science lingo, crude protein estimates, right? We need to correct those for both digestibility and amino acid content of those proteins to decide how much of that protein we can actually utilize, because the requirement is expressed in daily utilizable protein content. And something kind of terrifying happens when you do that. You take the first 103 countries off of that curve on the previous slide, and you and you put that same line on there, you can see that the original data set still looks pretty good. However, we know that plant proteins aren't necessarily as digestible as animal-based proteins, and when you correct for digestibility, you get 2/3 of that curve falling below the average RDA for protein line. And when you do the final correction for the amino acid composition of plant proteins, which are also tend to be quite a bit poorer than animal-based proteins, you find that more than half of the countries and territories of the world have an average protein intake that is below requirement. Now, this is a very, very different scenario to what we're used to talking about, right? We're used to talking about, we're looking at 2050, how are we going to make enough food in 2050 to feed the world? That's the wrong conversation. How are we going to feed the people of the world right now is the right conversation, because this is just protein. We can take any one of the indispensable nutrients that we need to take in and look at very similar curves. We need to understand where we are to understand where we need to go. And when you make these corrections, it changes the conversation around some of these other conversations that we have with agriculture, particularly some of the negative ones. The land use that we have to do to grow livestock, the fresh water that we use, the greenhouse gases, probably the biggest one with depression. Those conversations change when you correct the amount of product coming out of that system for digestibility and amino acid composition in this case. You can see that land use, as we're used to looking at, is much lower for things like wheat, rice, maize, the grains, than they are for animal-based proteins. But you can see when you correct for the superior digestibility and amino acid composition of the other proteins that we're in the same realm as wheat and grains when we talk about animal-based proteins. And milk is even in that same area, even though milk uses land that none of these other things use, the lands that cannot be used for grain production. So for fresh water, it's even worse. You know, fresh water becomes even more intensively used for grain-based crops or vegetable-based crops than it does for meat, milk, and eggs. There's something that we need to realize, and the greenhouse gas conversation changes completely as well. And this is just based on GWP. This is not based on the new estimates of global warming potential that come from methane, as we know very well from Miles Allen and Frank Mitloehner's work. So the conversation changes when we start talking about nutrient sufficiency rather than just the amount of food production that occurs in the world. This by Ty Beal, this is a slide from my friend Dr. Alice Shogan out of the University of Florida, shows the greenhouse gas footprint of eating enough food to require a third, just 1/3 of the adult RDA for iron, zinc, calcium, folate, vitamin A, and vitamin B12. So micronutrients that are required in our diets. And you can see that if you were to do that from grains and vegetable-based foods, you would actually have a far higher carbon footprint than you would getting it from something like one of the most nutrient-dense foods in the world, if you can tolerate it, and that's beef liver. But again, the point is to look at these nutrient metrics and actually understand when we are recommending making changes to our food systems, that these are very, very complex food systems, and we have to understand what their knock-on effects are. For example, if we are proposing elimination of animal agriculture. So those things are important, but I think the take-home from this section is we need more food. We don't need less food. And any conversation that we have that might be a societal intervention to do one thing or another thing that results in the reduction of food production in the world is extremely irresponsible, given that half of the world's countries and territories are deficient in some nutrient, in this case protein, but it could be any one of those things. So how do we do this, right? Where are we going to make that food? We need more food right now, not 2050, now. We've got the ocean. That's obviously very important, and we're going to do as much as we can with the ocean without destroying it to produce food from the ocean. But when you talk about cultivation of lands, we only have 4% of the world's surface area to deal with. We can't make more cultivatable land. We can chop down rainforests, I guess, or we can try and convert rangeland to cultivatable land, but there's a reason why that hasn't been done, and that's that it is not suitable for that purpose. So we don't have a lot to deal with in terms of being able to improve the amount of land that we have to work with. So what do we do? proposals to take ruminant agriculture off of the face of the planet are obviously not going to do food security any good, given that cellulose is essentially the most abundant utilizable carbon source on the planet, and we cannot feed our populations without it. So that's pretty important, and anything that proposes taking that away is completely going to decimate our food systems. So one of the reasons for that is, and I'm going to go down a cattle predominant conversation here, but I'm going to bring it back around to monogastrics as well, because I think they have a very strong case to make here as well. But cattle are the only animals that are essentially able to take non-protein nitrogen and extremely poor quality indigestible items and turn them into protein, and therefore they are the only class of animals that are able to create more protein than they actually eat. And that's when you talk about this net protein contribution from ROTS, the USDA numbers, you can see that they do certainly produce more protein than they utilize. And there's other estimates of this from Anne Motet at the FAO and several other publications. But this doesn't apply only to ruminants. Obviously, ruminants have a very special skill for being able to do this, but we take advantage of this to a certain extent in monogastrics as well. The issue that we have as humans is that we do not eat a balanced diet. We do not have somebody formulating rations for us to balance our amino acid composition so that we get the most out of our food. But monogastrics do. Probably some of the most tightly controlled rations in the world, and the best formulated rations in the world, are being fed to pigs and poultry. And that necessarily takes advantage of the fact that vegetable proteins that we're feeding these animals are incomplete. And we feed them with protein sources that complement each other so that the actual diet that we feed to the animal is balanced. And therefore, we end up with more protein than we would have had if we had to feed that corn and soy, for example, directly to people, because we do not balance the diets of people. So monogastrics certainly serve a very important role in increasing the amount of protein available to human populations as well. But you'll hear this one over and over, and I just addressed it to a certain extent, but not entirely. And that's that, well, why don't we just stop feeding all of this grain and soy and all of that stuff to animals and actually feed it to people? We could afford to feed more people. And that is a sound theory, I think, I guess, other than the fact that we have no more cultivatable land to feed all of this, to grow all of this food. But this is Anne Motet's work from the FAO. And you can see that actually 86% of the global livestock feed, this is total livestock feed, is considered inedible by humans. So it's a very small percentage of food that actually might have entered our food supply that's actually going to animals anyway, because we don't give good food to animals that would have been used for people, because that's pure economics. We would never do that. If something was more valuable being fed to a person than it was to an animal, then we wouldn't do it. So this is really important to understand this, and the fact that this is all nutrients entering our food system that wouldn't otherwise enter our food system. So all of this from the top, grass and leaves, crop residues, fodder crops, oilseed crops, byproducts, none of those are actually going into our food systems without animals in between them. So very, very important part of it. And taking that away again is irresponsible in my view, given where we are in the world with food sufficiency. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to kind of make a little bit of a segue now, but it is relevant to the current conversation, but also break up the seriousness a little bit. This is a little bit of a quiz. I know there's a couple of people that have seen this. This comes from Frank Midlerner. And this is a bit of a quiz. And the quiz is, which of the three ingredient lists here are the ingredients for Impossible Burger and the other alternate meat company? So two of the three are alternate meat recipes, and the third one is something else. And I know everyone's muted, so I'm not going to get a response to my quiz, but you can pick the one that you want in your head and then decide which one of those is not formulated for human consumption. And you can see that Beyond Meat is on the left, Impossible Burger on the right, and really nice premium vegan dog food in the middle. So you can see that those ingredient lists are not too dissimilar, but all jokes aside, I guess the point of this is the fact that these companies, there's nothing wrong with taking existing nutrients from our systems and mixing them together in recipes and making new products, right? There are hundreds and hundreds of companies that do this, consumer packaged goods. But let's not confuse ourselves into saying we're going to replace beef or we're going to replace milk or whatever it might be with some of these products. From a food security standpoint, replacing food production with food processing is a very, very bad idea. And you can imagine what will happen to total food production if we decide to start replacing mixing recipes with actually producing food. And we mustn't get that confused in their heads, because they make these types of statements all the time that we need to replace one with the other, whereas they are essentially just mixing recipes from existing things that are available within our food systems and not actually creating new protein. So it's important to recognize that. And again, replacing food processing with food production is not going to do the world situation any good. But another one of the arguments that you will hear is that, well, we need to shut down, cattle are killing the planet, and we need to shut down the overproduction of food in industrialized countries where there is too much of that made. The issue with that is that even if we were to do that, even though you talk about North America and you talk about beef production, for example, we're one of the most efficient places, if not the most efficient place on earth to create beef. You've got 6% of the world's cattle and 18% of the world's beef production. What happens if we shut that off, right? We're the best in the world at making beef. We shut off our beef production. Is that going to eliminate the beef production from the global market? Or is that beef production going to be shifted to places where it is made less efficiency and with a higher carbon footprint and perhaps less efficiently done? The answer is, of course, the second, right? We will not reduce beef production that's going to happen globally. We're just going to shift its location. Chances are then whether we're going to have to be clearing forests or having a much higher carbon footprint on that beef production than you would in the industrialized nation in the first place. So those arguments also do not stand when we're trying to talk about global food security. Another piece of this, I'm going to start transferring more from the food security standpoint now and more towards the environmental impact of food production a little bit, because they are so entangled in the commercial eye that it's really hard to get away from that. So I thought that this publication from Mary Dondaza and Juan Tricarico, this is a Dairy Management Inc. paper that looked at essentially some of the contributions that livestock make outside of what we generally think of as the benefits of livestock, right? We know they're making food. We know on the negative side that there's greenhouse gases and environmental effects associated with that. But it seems like our discussion is stuck on the negative side when it comes to livestock, right? You think about cattle, that all we are talking about is greenhouse gases. We're not talking about any of the biological cycles that have to go into place for animal production to occur. And this paper, I think, is a really nice look at some of the side benefits we don't necessarily think about of livestock production. In this case, we're looking at dairy. This is US dairy. And these folks did a survey of byproduct use in US dairies. And it might not sound very exciting until you dig into what they actually found. Now, US dairies consume 40 million metric tons of byproducts a year. That's about 12 kilos as fed of byproducts per cow per day. And per kilogram of byproduct, now this is within news headline stars, right? Per kilogram of byproduct that those cows are eating, they are creating 70 grams of CO2 equivalents, right? They're making methane. They're creating 70 grams of CO2 equivalents. That's bad. Get rid of cows, right? Okay, we get rid of the cows. Where do those byproducts go? Most of those byproducts are not even utilizable by other classes of livestock, perhaps beef cattle. They're definitely getting rid of beef cattle in this scenario as well. So what happens to those byproducts that the cows are currently eating? Well, you could compost them. That might be one of the most responsible things to do. You're going to lose a lot of the nutrients, right? Because those cows are harvesting nutrients out of those byproducts, and those are entering our food system. Remember, half the world is hungry. But the amount of greenhouse gases that come off of those byproducts when you compost them is 5 times what they would be if they went through a cow. All of a sudden, you have the non-utilization of those byproducts creating more greenhouse gases than the cows themselves would. Thinking about cows as reducing greenhouse gases rather than producing them. If we put those byproducts in the landfill, which is most likely scenario to happen if we didn't have anything else to do with them, you would end up with 49 times more greenhouse gases emitted from those byproducts than coming out of the cows themselves. So before we start proposing changes to agriculture systems, we need to understand all of these knock-on effects that would actually happen if we eliminated animal agriculture. And again, as I say, remember that we're going to lose the food associated with those byproducts as well. So it's not all doom and gloom, though, right? How do we actually do this? We're in a tough situation. We've got to feed the world now and into the future. And how do we do it? So I think that all of us involved in agriculture have a pretty good idea on how we move this forward. Obviously, it involves utilizing the resources that we have, using grasslands to produce as much food as possible and capturing carbon at the same time. Correcting poor amino acid composition of plant proteins by putting them through animal systems, and getting our ranchers and our livestock producers paid for the things that they are doing for this food system. Interesting way of looking at it from the other side. This is from Sarah Place's work, basically looking at the carbon footprint of the world if we were to improve non-industrialized agriculture nations' feed efficiency, essentially, to match those of industrialized agriculture nations. And you would see that the carbon footprint of beef production, in this case, throughout the world would drop by 45% if we were to implement the progress that we've seen in industrialized nations. Now, obviously, the flip side of that means that we can make much, much, much more food with the same environmental footprint as we could before if we implement the things that we know work to improve the efficiency and productivity of livestock. So I think that's pretty important. I didn't want to leave that section on a negative note because although it does seem dire from Paul Moen's work, there are lots of things that many people and organizations are doing around the world to correct those situations. So I'm going to go to the environment specifically here now for a short amount of time that I have left, and just discuss some of the effects that livestock supposedly have on the environment and how we should be, in my opinion, thinking about some of these things. So the problem that we do have is that we've got these, you don't have to discuss whether this is true or not. This is just atmospheric carbon dioxide and methane levels. These come from ice cores because we didn't have sensors going back 1 million years in this case. These data come from NASA, and you can see that even though you cannot see the current year after 0 AD on the curve, you can see that the levels of carbon dioxide and methane are very unusual and do not fall anywhere near the normal cycles of these gases in our environment. And this is the reason why you have a lot of scientists sounding the alarm all over the world about global warming. But if you go in and you can actually access this on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, website, this is a US government website, you can go in and look at what is causing the warming. You don't need to talk about sources of gases or of greenhouse gases. You can just look at what is actually causing warming. And the curve on the right is one that, or the curve on the left, excuse me, shows radiative forcing, or essentially warming, that is being caused by different gases that are in our environment. And you can see, of course, as we know, CO2 in blue is the main contributor, followed quite far behind by methane. But what I want to point out to you is that methane since 1979 to 2019, over the past 40 years, has not appreciably increased. Even though I just showed you a curve where methane concentration was vertical on an axis, the effect of that methane on warming has only gone up rather modestly, especially compared to carbon dioxide. And if you zero out this data set at 1979 and you look at what has changed the amount of warming in the environment since 1979, you can see that the entirety of the warming effect, or increase in warming effect since 1979, is by CO2 itself. Now, the last time I checked, increases in CO2 in the environment are not coming out of cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens. So with that being said, it's really important that we understand this, because these figures do not say anything about the sources of these gases. They are simply saying these are the gases in the environment, and that is the effect on warming. So we have something to defend ourselves, right? That doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at things that are going to correct this issue, right? We know very clearly that if we are able to eliminate methane production from farm animals, that we can actually induce a cooling effect on the environment, because the removal of methane from the environment actually reduces warming quite quickly. Whereas when you remove, let me rephrase that, when you remove the production of methane, you don't actually have to physically take the methane out of the environment. That happens automatically. You just have to stop making it. That is not the case for CO2, obviously. You could stop making CO2 and that CO2 stays in the environment. So we have an opportunity to actually positively affect this warming cascade by removing the production of methane. But we are also the only industry in the world, agriculture and forestry, the only industries in the world that capture carbon as a part of our business model, right? That puts us in a unique position to do something about this, even though we are not the cause of that problem. We've been doing work for several years now with an interesting outfit out of Florida called Buck Island Ranch, where there is an ecological research station called Archibald Expeditions. And what they've found is they've been looking at both the emissions from cattle on a working cow ranch, but also looking at it from an ecosystem standpoint, right? Not just the amount of methane that's coming out of the cows, which all the news stories get, but what does the whole system do, right? Because that's the important part. We always need life cycle estimates, not point estimates of greenhouse gases in this case. And this has really given us an opportunity to look at this. And when you look at the ability of pastures to consume or to sequester carbon, they by far outstrip the methane being produced by those cattle in the first place. In this situation, in fact, this work is published, and as I say, again, I'm happy to share this, but you can see that grazed lands on the top curve. You've got the emissions from the cattle, or emissions from the land and cattle, because this is a Florida swamp, so they've got some methane coming off of that land. The sequestration being the gray curve at the bottom, and the NEE, or net ecosystem exchange. That's the amount of greenhouse gas, CO2 equivalent flux between the land containing the cattle and the environment. It's negative on grazed land. You pull the cattle off, it's positive. That land is net emitting from a greenhouse gas or warming perspective when there's no cattle on. Even though there's more methane. This is what all the news story is about, is the difference between this little gray curve here and that little gray curve there, is what all the news is about. But no one talks about this. It's hard to measure. That's why no one wants to put their foot in the sand, but we can't ignore it. It's really important that we consider these things and understand what this looks like moving forward, because the scale of sequestration is dramatically larger than the potential scale of emissions that are coming out of cattle. And they believe, this is a meta-analysis from 2021, that we are looking at probably average reductions in emission, if we can manipulate it, of about close to 50% if we manipulate sequestration, rather than the around 8% that is suggested from interfering with the animals' diets. So it's absolutely important that we talk about this, even though we do not yet have all the tools that we need to measure this and manipulate this on site. We can't just not talk about it because it's difficult to measure. So I guess I wanted to leave it on a positive note here. I asked somewhat facetiously, but also somewhat seriously, whether we're actually in the business of farming for food or farming for carbon. I think that we've gone from having probably the most important job in the world, and that's to feed the world, to having the two most important jobs. And we may well be called on to be the ones to reverse climate change as well. So, Jean, I know I'm probably a little bit over, but I did want to get that out and leave us on a positive message before we get to questions.
Yeah, I wasn't going to stop you, because as you went through, there's things I learned, and I'm sure everybody that is on this call, on this webinar, is learning things as well. Anybody with any questions for Vaughn or comments for him, please put them in the Q&A. I do have a couple here. I'm going to go to one that it said, if there's a balanced scorecard for the livestock sector, one that could take all the important considerations into account and be used to report progress, what would you suggest are the factors to be included? Not like it's an easy question.
I think if anything, my presentation would have shown that that is probably the most important thing that we need to do and the hardest thing for us to do. There's a couple of factors, and I'm not going to. Obviously, it would take a very long time to rattle through everything, and I wouldn't get them all anyway. But I think primarily we need to be looking at the contribution of whether it's plant agriculture or animal agriculture to the food system. We need to be quantifying any kind of metric that we're looking at in terms relative to the amount of food production that it's creating. If we want to minimize the impact on the environment or maximize the benefit to the environment, it has to be done on a per food unit and a food unit that actually makes sense, right? So I think that's one critical thing. I think on the other side of things is measuring the metrics, right? Obviously, methane is important. I think methane is more important as an opportunity for us than it is as a black eye, which is the way that most of us look at it these days. Methane is obviously very important. We are going to need to be looking at sequestration very, very closely. And when I say that, I don't imply that people aren't. There's a lot of groups looking at understanding how sequestration works and how we can manipulate it, probably most importantly, how we can measure it on site without having to wait 10 years to look at changes in soil carbon. So that's going to be a really critical part of any accounting system, is to actually be able to measure, estimate, guesstimate, use satellites or whatever it might be to actually get sequestration. But there's a lot of other pieces as well, right? I mentioned briefly some of these services that our industries provide, like keeping raw materials out of landfills, maintaining biodiversity, water use, leaching into water tables. It's a very, very, very big list. And I doubt, at least in the near future, that we're going to be able to come up with a single metric to encompass all of that. Very complex system. But understanding as much of that as we can and voicing that in our day-to-day conversations is half of the battle.
Well, and you gave us some great statistics that we can certainly pull out to use, and with the data behind them, which very appreciative. I'm going to, a couple very interesting presentations. Somebody else has great presentation, and they want to know, has anyone looked at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for a Beyond Meat burger versus a meat burger?
Yes, that has been done. I'm trying to think offhand who the author is. I know Frank Mittler in his lab at UC Davis. It might not be Frank himself, but the lab in UC Davis has done some of those footprint analyses. So again, it's going to very much determine also what you use as the denominator, right? Is emissions or whatever it might be per what? Is it per unit of protein produced? Because you can't divide by 0, right? Mm-hmm. Essentially, when you divide by 0, that equals infinity. So if you want to look at the emissions of Impossible Burger per unit of protein produced, they're infinite, because there's no protein produced to dilute that by. So again, complex, but there are publications out there that have looked at that, and it doesn't look good for those companies.
What do you think of cellular agriculture to help feed the world with animal proteins in the future?
So if we're talking about, and maybe we can get a clarification, I'm not sure if that's going to come through in the Q&A, but are we talking about cell-cultured meats? Is that?
Yes, I believe that, yeah, that's what they're looking at.
Yeah, so I think that that is a legitimate research avenue for us, particularly if we can find a way to feed those cell cultures things that we don't already eat. And that's the critical part of this, right? at the moment, the way the science is the inputs that are required for those systems to create the meat have to come from current sources of our food. And in a lot of cases, they're a lot more expensive and a lot more resource intensive than current meat production is. So you either have to have bovine fetal cells or growth factors that come out of animals, and you have to have amino acids to feed those cultures, amino acids that come from our systems that we already have. So those are interesting, but only if we can find ways to feed them things that we don't already eat. Like if we can figure out how to make meat out of urea and sunshine, great, you know, because that adds to our food supply. But making meat out of soy protein isolate and bovine fetal serum is not a food security solution.
Thanks. Going to the grazed versus ungrazed grassland information was very interesting. How do you account for the improved sequestration for the grazed grassland versus the ungrazed grassland?
That's cool data, isn't it? So I'm going to preface this to say that this doesn't happen in every situation, right? I think it's important that we understand that this can happen. The researchers in question, this, as I said, this is Archibald Expeditions at Buck Island Ranch in Florida. They've actually gone through and done subsequent studies after this to understand what is the source of that increased carbon. A lot of it, they believe, has to do with the fact that the grazing action on the plants forces the plants to put deeper roots into the soil, and that obviously the action of the roots into the soil is pushing carbon further and further down into the soil. It's got a lot to do with there's a lot of theories about locomotion, the actual action of the animal's hooves pushing manure down into the soil that cause sequestration. And there's a lot of work actually looking at the interaction between obviously the nutrients provided by the animals and the microbiome of the soil, in that the microbiome is stimulated by the presence of the manure, the degraded products from the plants. All the growth factors that come through from the animals actually stimulate the microbiome in the soil and causes capture of carbon into that microbiome and into the soil.
Interesting.
And the other half of that equation, even though it wasn't a question, is that if the animals aren't taking that biomass off of the surface, you run into the same situation as you did with the byproducts in the dairy system, right? Those plants are going to die and are going to rot, and they're going to create their own greenhouse gases. So if you don't capture some of that carbon into a useful product, that stuff is gassing off into the environment anyway. You can see that actually in those curves.
It's really interesting. We got, if there's any more questions, I've got one more here, and it kind of encompasses a whole lot that you've said. And it's really hard for those involved in the day-to-day activities of livestock organizations to be focused very far into the future. What good examples have you seen where sectors, and that's dairy, beef, poultry, pork, have come together and plant a flag for the future of the whole livestock sector?
It's a pretty, it's a good one.
Yeah, I told you, it's all encompassing.
You might want to give me 10 minutes. I think that those examples are everywhere. I think if you look at the share of research money at the moment that's being spent in the livestock industry on sustainability of our food systems, it is 8 out of every $10 that's being spent. I think I think that happened initially defensively, right? Is that everyone's accusing agriculture of all these nefarious things. But I think that we've realized that we have this critical role to play in the future of the world. So I think that there's really interesting areas. I'm trying to come up with an example of, one thing that lifts us all. And it may be just understanding the grandiose nature of the challenge that's upon us, not just looking at 9 billion people in 2050, because everyone loved saying that, but it was always a distant thing that someone else might have to deal with. But understanding that we are in trouble right now, and every every 1/10 of a point on feed efficiency that we make, every 100 grams of live weight gain that we make through whatever intervention that we come up with is going towards feeding people in the world that need that food right now. So I guess it's more of a just bringing pride and honor back to the sector that's been under fire for no good reason for many years, I think is going to be important.
Okay.
I know I didn't directly answer the question and I kind of dodged it, but that's where we are.
I do have 2 other questions that have come in. We are at 12:40, but if you're okay, we'll
I'm fine,
ask.
yeah.
Thanks. That somebody's asking, are cattle the best carbon sequesters, or are other animals like goats or sheep or buffalo better?
I don't know that I've seen comparative data between different types of animals. I guess my gut feeling is that it probably doesn't matter too much. I think even hindgut fermenters are going to be depositing rich microbiome enriched manure onto the soil. So I don't know that it's probably it probably doesn't matter too much what they are, is my gut feeling, but I'm not aware of any research that compares different species in that regard.
I remember
reading how to
reading,
measure that first. Yeah.
I remember reading something elephants having a big impact on the environment, where there was some desertification had been formed, and they put elephants on it, and it was amazing the impact it had for bringing the grasslands back.
A lot of that has to do with the fact that they knock down trees. Yeah, I think I've seen the same research that you're talking about, Gene. So,
okay, one last question. From your perspective, how do we best change the mainstream narrative and get the science-based messages out that you've shared with us today?
$1 million question. You know, it starts with us, right? I'm a solid believer in if you present people with reasonable information that is well organized, that people will listen to it. I know you get people that are not going to move regardless, but it starts with us. We are just as responsible as everyone else for overemphasizing something like methane. Everything is methane at the moment. I went to an environmental impact of livestock conference recently, and it was every single paper. I think there were 60-something papers that were presented. Every single one of them was on emissions, nothing on sequestration. So I think that we as an industry have to start by having a balanced view, a realistic view of what the entire system looks like, and be very, very clear about where your facts come from and the entire story. And only then can we start communicating it to others, right? So we've got to get our story straight to begin with. It's complex. I'm not accusing anyone of the fact that they don't know these things. That's the biggest problem that we have, is that our message is extremely complex. And the counter message coming from the groups that would rather see animal agriculture go away is very, very simple. Methane, cows make methane, methane is bad for the environment. Easy. Our counter argument is not that simple, and that's our biggest challenge. And if we can figure out how to take care of that, is to get bandwidth from the common consumer to actually explain that. That's the biggest challenge, and that's the part of it that I don't know how we do it. But we have to start by getting our own message straight.
Well, great spot to end. Thank you very much, Vaughn, for your message. To everybody that's on the call, we have recorded this. When we get the recording up, we will share it with you as well. It will be available through our YouTube on our website. And we do have a white paper, as Chloe mentioned, coming out that Vaughn is helping. Chloe and Vaughn are working on it together, that it will have a lot of this information in it. That and the other thing we do, we'll take that white paper and have some of it distilled down into what we call On the Fly, which is a 1-pager that'll have some of these statistics and stats that we'll give you the quick, we'll try and get the quick versus the whole give the whole picture in a quick statement. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's what we need, Gene. So I think that's amazing, is to have that cheat sheet, because we need those little tidbits of information to have the conversation with someone on the plane or the subway or whatever it is. So that's great.
Yeah, like the notes I've written down
There you
today.
go.
So thank you very much. And as mentioned earlier, we've got a couple more coming up. We don't have dates set for them, but watch our feed, and we've got more information coming out. Thanks everybody for joining.